My name's Ron. I'm president of the Otter Creek Audubon Society. Just get to the arrows here. A few events to talk about coming up.
Oops.
Monthly wildlife walk this Saturday at Otterview Park at 8 a.m. Nobody came to the walk last time because it was the day after a blizzard/ice storm. So I got to walk alone. I took some really great pictures. These aren't them. I guarantee, unlike last time, you will be able to get into the parking lot. It won't have 3 feet of snow blocking it if you come. We have our Morgan Road Salamander Escorts program coming up with the Salisbury Conservation Commission. If you would like to take part in that, we go out on rainy nights, late March, early April, and we count the frogs and salamanders that cross the road. And it's really quite an experience to carry some of these really cool spotted salamanders in your hand. So if you want to do that, there's a sign-up sheet over there. It says Salamander Crossing Sign Up. Sign up even if you have signed up in the past, because we throw out the email list every year. And I think that's all our events. All right. And we'll switch over to this. And I think Hank has pretty much introduced himself there. There we go.
This is my trip to the Great Sand Dunes National Park.
So tonight's speaker has been here many times before. We're always happy to have him every year and anytime, as many times as he wants to come back. World traveling bird watcher, over 7,000 birds on his life list. He's been all over the world, so his pictures are always great. So everyone, Hank Kaestner.
Thank you. Thank you all for risking your life to be here tonight. I'm really impressed. My friend Larry, all the way from Shelburne, practically a neighbor. Matter of fact, you were in this presentation that I gave a couple of weeks ago. You haven't seen this one? Oh, thank you for coming, at any rate. Okay, it's going to be good. When people say, oh, you're a bird traveler, you're just going to see birds, there's so much more to bird trips than simply the birds. And we're going to go into a lot of different categories tonight in the program. Travel is geography. You learn a lot about the world when you travel. It's culture. It's history. You're going to see that a little bit, the slave trade history of Ghana. Language, food, geopolitical situation in the world as it changes, commerce, nature, especially birds, and conservation, ecotourism. We're going to talk about all those things just a little bit tonight, but that's what travel is. It's just so much more than bird watching. The geography part is interesting because here's a map of Africa. We're going to be in Ghana. Ghana is the G that you see there in the middle left-hand side. The northern part is mainly the Sahara, and the upper left is M for Morocco. A lot of people go to Morocco. Upper right is Egypt, part of Africa, but more like the Middle East. And then UKT is Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. That's where most people go on tours to Africa. Down at the bottom is B for Botswana in South Africa. A lot of people go there. Neighboring Namibia is also very, very popular. M is the island of Madagascar. A lot of ecotourism in that part of the world, but not so much in West Africa. The reason I wanted to go to West Africa is being a bird watcher and having been to many other parts of Africa, it was an area where the birds were completely different than the birds I'd seen elsewhere. As you look at the Congo and you see the green around the Congo, that's the Congo jungle. Most of Africa is savanna. You've seen pictures of the giraffes in the savanna and the lilac-breasted rollers and the bee-eaters and the birds like that. South Africa and Botswana, the same way. It's open country. The birds are easy to see. In the Congo are hundreds and hundreds of species of birds that are found just in that jungle forest. Very, very difficult to get to politically. Very, very difficult to see the birds once you get there. If you look at where the G is, where Ghana, it's another green patch. It's another lowland jungle, a completely different habitat than you would find elsewhere in Africa. So that's my incentive of going there, was to see birds that I'd never seen before. This is a close-up of Ghana. There's the red dot that shows Ghana. It's surrounded primarily by countries that speak French. Almost all the countries, with the exception of Nigeria and Liberia, are French-speaking. Ghana is an English-speaking place, so it's relatively easy to get around. This tour I took with Rock Jumper Tours. It's called the Comprehensive and the Rock Fowl and Upper Guinea Specials. It's that rock fowl was the bird that I wanted to see. If I saw no other birds, but I just saw the rock fowl, I would have been happy. This is a map of Ghana. In the lower right, you see Accra, the capital. This is where we flew into. And then the stops that we made, Kakum National Park, number 1. The place where the rockfowl live, number 2, Mole National Park, number 3, up in the north. As you get up in the north, you get away from the wet forest and you get into the dry forest first, and then up in 4 along the Burkina Faso border, it's almost sub-Saharan, it's almost desert. So you get a wide range of habitats, and then we ended up close to Accra at number 5 in the Atewa Forest. So that's where we're going to go. In Africa, culture starts right away. It'll knock you off your seat. The people in West Africa, so many people along the road, it just is mind-boggling. And I think that's true for other parts of Africa as well. Businesses, there are lots of local businesses. You don't see a Walmart, you don't see stores like that, but everybody has their own business selling almost everything. Here's a shoe salesman alongside the road. This is the way the people dress. The people dress very, very well. Ghana is a relatively rich country. The per capita income is probably the 2nd or 3rd highest in all of Africa. So the people there are dressed very, very nicely. It's very, very pleasant to see them walking around. In south part of Ghana, the religion there is Christianity. And it's amazing that almost every business that you see is named Jesus My CEO, for example. Or the next one, In God I Trust Music Production. They are so religious, so fanatical, so Christian that they use that terminology all over the place. Lots of signs along the road for churches, for prayer camps, encounter with God, 30-day with encounter with God. I was just amazed at all these signs along the road. And then the sign that surprised me the most, that when I came home and researched this, I couldn't believe what I was understanding. Lots of signs that says perfect white, mirror effect, you are perfect. And this is a chemical called hydroquinone that makes your skin lighter. And I thought, why would Africans want to make their skin lighter? I researched it, and more than 50% of the women in Ghana and 50% of the women in Nigeria, which is a much bigger population, use these skin whitening products. More than 50%. This is a New York Times article kind of fact that really surprised me. And even the birds are using this to try to lighten up. I mean, the first crow that we can do, you can just see him with his dipping this into hydroquinone and rubbing it on his chest. He couldn't get much more of his body than his chest and the back of his neck. He was trying to do his best, but this was the pied crow, one of the first birds that we saw. The pied winged swallow, he tried to try to lighten up a little bit. This was one of many birds that was found just uniquely in West Africa. This is a lifer for me, one of the birds that I especially wanted to see. It looks very much like our tree swallow, except for that white patch on the wing. Some of the other typical African birds, that first day as we left Accra and drove out along the coast, the northern red bishop, a very small bird off in the distance. Sometimes you don't get very good looks at birds at first, but the African gray hornbill, got a little bit closer and you can see that hornbill, very, very good description. As we left Africa and drove along the coast, our first major stop is going to be at a slave castle. And these are castles along the coast where the people 300 or 400 years ago were gathering slaves and shipping them off to the New World. But it's very much an area along the beach, beautiful beach. If this was anywhere else in the world, there'd be a Trump hotel or something along here. Just beautiful countryside, people out in the water. But we were looking back beyond the sandbars and into the coastal lagoons. People there were fishing. They were competing with the herons. This is the western reef heron. The pied kingfisher, one of the common African birds, but one of the ones that's easy to see, giant bill. Just a pretty bird to see. People there were catching fish and drying the fish. And again, as you go and you're bird watching, you see what the people do, what the culture is. And here they were drying the fish, which I thought was interesting, putting it into baskets and then carrying it back into town. And I thought, well, this is pretty primitive, you know. And then I looked at this girl. She's got her cell phone. She's talking to somebody back at the house. Okay, honey, keep the door open. I'll be there with my basket of fish. Really amazing to see this modern things come into what you think is a primitive part of the world. It really isn't. It's as modern as we have here. Some of the birds there in that area, the Senegal Thick-knee. And if you can guess, this is a nocturnal bird. Why is it a nocturnal bird? How can you tell that?
Big eye.
Big eye. Look at that big eye. Yeah, nocturnal bird. This is the yellow-throated longclaw. Which Vermont bird does this look like? A meadowlark. Doesn't it look exactly like a meadowlark? Every time I see this bird, pretty widespread bird. If you've been to Kenya, it's a common bird in the grasslands of Kenya as well. Not so special, but just a decent picture. A little bit of history about the slave trade, because Ghana was one of the major areas where the slaves were gathered up and sent to the Western Hemisphere in the 1700s, 1800s. This is what the fort looks like. There are several dozen of these forts along the coast. First the Portuguese, Vasco da Gama came around to Africa, and then the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese and many different European countries came along and built forts in order to control the slave trade coming out of there. This plaque was unveiled by President Barack Obama about 10 years before we were there. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama were at that place. We had a tour. It wasn't just bird watching. We had a wonderful tour. Took a couple hours. We learned a lot about slavery that I didn't know. You know, we think of slavery primarily as a Confederate U.S. problem or a result of them. Slavery was gone at the time of the Roman Empire. The Romans were bringing slaves out of Africa. The Greeks were using slaves. This had been going on for many, many hundreds of years before they came to the Western Hemisphere. This is a map that shows the movement of slaves from Africa, and one of the biggest areas was the Belgian Congo, King Leopold. I just finished a wonderful book about King Leopold. What a horrible fellow he was. Millions and millions of people sent out of the Congo in primarily to Brazil. The Portuguese were opening up Brazil. They had all this land but nobody to work it, so a lot of the slaves went there. A smaller number actually to the United States. Most of them went into the Caribbean, into South America, not so much North America. However, in North America, I learned that the first slaves that came into North America were in 1619. And I saw this date in today's New York Times. There was an article about the slave trade in the United States, and it mentioned this group from 1619 in Jamestown, the first slaves that arrived in the Western Hemisphere. As we walked through the fort, we went into these rooms and were told that hundreds of slaves would be tied up in each of these different rooms. And they were tied up, they had no clothes on, they had no toilet facilities, they had very little food, and about 50% of them died either coming down to the fort or while they were in the fort before they got on the boat. Now, if you were shipping out cattle or shipping out sheep or shipping out chickens to the Western Hemisphere to grow, you would want to make sure that all of them lived, because that's money. But these people were they were worth less than you could possibly imagine, that half of them died under these absolutely hard conditions. This was just some of the things in the museum that we read about, the slave trade, the forced migration. About 10 million black Africans were sent to the Western Hemisphere. It was absolutely incredible. And then there was this plaque up on the wall that talked about some of the positive things of the European influence in Africa. And one of the things they underline, it says, introduction of new agricultural crops and animals to the Gold Coast of Ghana, the concern for formal education, literacy, Christian religion, all sorts of things have come into Africa as a result of the Europeans coming there. So it wasn't all just the negative of slavery, but there was some positive benefits that are still intact there today. This is the walkway coming out of that castle where millions of Africans would have been on their way to the Western Hemisphere, just to be there in the footsteps of that horrible mass exodus. This was the scene that I started the program with, but just to show you again some of the hustle bustle of the coastal area, very, very beautiful. Yellow-billed kite flew over as we were coming out. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about ecotourism. This is the hotel, the first hotel that we stayed in Kakum National Park, the Rainforest Hotel. This is providing many jobs. Ecotourism has done a wonderful job of, number one, providing jobs for people in countries all over the world, but also in protecting the forest, because you've got to have the national parks or the forests with the animals or the birds to attract the foreigners to come in there. So there are two benefits of ecotourism, very important. This is our group. It was a small group. There were only 6 or 7 of us. Our guide, Nigel Redmond, famous British ornithologist, who's written a couple bird books on birds of Africa. We were lucky to have him. This was the food as you travel around the world. If you're in Mexico, or if you're in Italy, you come back and say, oh boy, I had a taco in Mexico, or I had a pizza in Venice. You know, all the food is so important. In Ghana, that's not the case. We had the same thing every meal for the 2 weeks that we were there. It was absolutely amazing. We had French fries, we had fried bananas, we had either chicken and a little bit of rice every meal. However, the French fried potatoes were considered by all 7 of us the best French fried potatoes that we had ever had. And I don't know why. It must be the oil they cook it in, but we just loved the French fries there. So, the local people, it's a rice ball and goat soup. That kind of a thing is very big for them. Stews are very big, as you can see down at the bottom. This was our driver. This is how the local people would eat their soup or stew. This is the meal coming to market. We saw this gal coming, a goat to bring into town, probably maybe for dinner or for Sunday meal. We weren't sure. Some of the other foods, lots of fresh fruits. We're in the tropics, so you get pineapples and bananas. Here's a gal with lots of apples, probably imported apples, actually. Apples don't normally grow in the jungles of Africa, so she was probably had brought those in from someplace else. Very friendly people. We liked, especially the young kids, they were always waving at us. That's fun when you're a tourist, when you're from the outside and the people are welcoming you, even if it's just little kids. Not so much sports on this trip. This is the only picture I got of any sports, but I think this guy's got potential. He's got that, look at the look in his eye. Doesn't he look like he's just going to get that ball in the goal no matter what? We may hear about him sometime in the future. The first park that we go to is Kaestner National Park. This is in that rainforest area of the southern part of Ghana, where there are going to be lots of new birds for me. The attraction there is a number of aerial walkways that go up through the trees. Now that's great if it's a sunny day, but if it's cloudy or if it's foggy as it was when we were there, very difficult to see the birds. And if you've ever birdwatched in the jungle, if you've been to the Amazon or you've been to Malaysia or wherever it is, jungle birding is difficult. It's hard to see the birds. They hear you coming, they disappear. And that was certainly the case here. There were some birds, the brown-cheeked hornbill, was a rare bird, the rufous-sided broadbill. But these are all sort of nondescript birds that you just get a glimpse of and off they go. It's not very rewarding at all, and it's really impossible to get enough of these pictures to make an audience like this audience think, oh boy, there's some good pictures Hank got on his trip to Ghana. The yellow-browed Chimeroptera, interesting name. The only mammal that we saw, you go to Africa to see the big five or all these animals. You go to West Africa, if you get a glimpse of one, this was the only mammal that we saw in Kaestner National Park, the patu. It's a nocturnal animal. It was a neat one to see, I must say, but that's not so great. The birds were much easier to see in the cut-over forest along the edge of the national parks, as it turns out. And there were trails like this with some of the original trees there where you could see the birds sitting in the trees. There were 2 groups of birds that were very common. One are called weavers. Weavers are really neat birds. If you look in the bill of this male weaver, you see a long green piece of vegetation. If you look in the upper right, you can see what he's doing with that. He is weaving the nest. And that's where the word weavers come from. Probably 60 or 70 different species of weavers in Africa. Some of them yellow, some of them black, some of them chestnut, different colors. But the weavers are just fascinating birds for the way that they make their nest. This was one called the village weaver. And then the second group of birds that are very common out in the open, and if any of you have been to Africa, you've seen either the rollers or the bee-eaters, and you remember especially the bee-eaters. It's a group of 30 or 40 different species in Africa that are out in the open country. They are sort of like hummingbirds in a way, just brightly colored. We saw lots of them on this trip. The white-throated bee-eater, got a decent photo of him. The red-throated bee-eater, one that's found just in West Africa. This is a special bird that we came to see. My favorite picture, and this is a lousy photograph, but I just like the looks of this red-throated bee-eater jumping off the branch and flying away. The black bee-eater, this is a Congo forest bee-eater that's found in that West African forest. The rosy bee-eater found just in West Africa. This was another lifer for me. And then the final bee-eater of that morning was this spider. And if you look closely, there's some bees there that he's caught. The red spider is about the size of a spider, a black widow spider, something that we would find here. Can you imagine how big that spider is? I've never seen a bigger spider. I've seen tarantulas, and they're big hairy things, and they walk around, and they're pretty impressive. This guy, by his size, was the most impressive spider that I'd ever seen. When we were in the slave castle, I remember showing you the slide that said introducing new agricultural crops is one of the positive things that the Europeans had brought into West Africa. And it's certainly true with this cacao. Does everybody know what cacao is? It's native to the Western Hemisphere. It was discovered by Hernan Cortez when he conquered the Aztecs in Mexico in 1519. He was given a drink, the chocolate drink, the first hot chocolate drink by Montezuma. Probably the original Montezuma's Revenge. We're not sure if that's really true or not. I'm making that part up, but at any rate, people don't realize that this fruit is very, very tasty. The white material that's around the seeds is one of the best fruits. Very, very, very sweet, and I was happy to be there during the harvest season. 1 million tons of cacao seeds are produced in Ghana each year. That's how important a crop it is. Very, very, 1 million tons coming to primarily Western Europe and the United States.
Do you know what insect pollinates the cacao?
The cacao, I do not know, no.
The mosquito.
It does, really? Wow. It's interesting that it's one of the few fruits that's actually grown on the trunk rather than at the end of the branches. But that's a good point to know. I'll have to remember that. Another tree crop that comes from which country?
Brazil.
Brazil, okay, it comes from Brazil. Do you recognize that tree crop? Another big tree crop there. This is what rubber looks like. Another cultivation there that we saw. Oil palm, also very, very important. Probably the reason the French fries were so delicious, the palm oil that they were cooked in, I'm guessing. Lots of work for the people when they harvest the oil palm and bring it down, separate the berries, put them out to dry. Big problem with these crops, whether it's cacao or whether it's the rubber or whether it's oil palm, is cutting down the forest and growing just acres and acres of just uniform monoculture. And we certainly saw this there. In Southeast Asia, it's even worse with a lot of these crops where jungles being cutting down and species of birds and animals disappearing forever. We went with a group called Ashanti African Tours. They've done a wonderful job of ecotourism, of building the infrastructure for the tourists that they do. This is a school that they built in a little village in the middle of nowhere. And this is the way the people live in that village. This village is famous because 15 years ago, the government of Ghana was trying to find out if there were any rockfowl in the country so that they could set this up for a tourism destination. And this fellow there in the middle with the white shirt on found rockfowl on a mountain behind his property there. And he went back to the government and said, I found some, and they set up this bird watching tour just to see this very, very hard to see bird, the rockfowl. So he led us up the hill. We walked for about an hour. Through the woods, up a very steep path. And 3 hours later, we came down this path after a rainstorm, and I tripped and fell. And I fell probably 50 feet through the jungle there on my way down. I didn't hurt myself. I was very lucky, but very, very dangerous trail. We finally get up to a bench. We sit on the bench, and the guy says, we may have to wait 2 or 3 hours for the rockfowl to come back. Well, I said, okay, that's all right. So we all sat down on the bench. I was not on the bench. And the bench collapsed, and all my friends were sitting there. And then right after that, it started to rain. So my friends go under the rock where the rockfowl is supposed to come sometime in the next hour or two. So they were sitting there waiting for the rockfowl, and it finally did come. Just a spectacular bare-headed bird, a family of birds, just 2 species, both of them in West Africa, very rare, difficult to see. I didn't get a very clear picture, but at least you can see that I did find the rockfowl. We're going to leave now and go halfway up north part of the country to a park that's very similar to the parks in East Africa, sort of a savanna habitat. This is called the Mole National Park. Very good infrastructure there, good roads, nice places to stay, swimming pools, nice lodges, lots of birds around. This is the commonest bird there at the lodge, the red-cheeked cordon bleu. I've always liked the name of that bird. When I saw it first in Kenya many years ago, it was one of my favorite birds on my first trip to Africa. The chestnut-crowned sparrow weaver, not so impressive. I had a book, and I still do, called The Birds of Ghana, and on the cover is this wonderful bird called the violet turako, and this is one of the first birds that we saw right at the lodge. This is sitting in a tree right outside the lodge. The western gray plantain eater, banana eater, closely related to the turakos. Egyptian vultures were common there. Bruce's green pigeon sitting right out in the open for all of us to see. This is a bird that's specifically just in sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel area of Africa, in Saudi Arabia. Yemen is where I saw my first one years ago, but in the very dry areas of North Africa, so that was a good bird for a lot of the people on the trip. Then off in the distance, one of the birds that I really was looking forward to seeing, and you can see the bird there, and you can see it a lot closer, the bearded barbet. Barbet's a large family group of birds found in Africa and Asia. A different closely related group of barbets in South America, but they are big-billed birds that are very brightly colored. And this one, called the bearded barbet, could not be better named. Just a spectacular bird right outside our lodge. The green monkeys were a monkey species just found in West Africa. Somebody asked me why are they called green monkeys, and if you look really carefully on the top of his head, it's a little greenish tint. That's about as green as the green monkey gets. This was the observation platform from the dining room that we were in, and you can see the elephants down below. They were trying to get some water, I guess, into their ears. The cob, some of the animals that we saw, olive baboon and the warthogs were walking right along the cabins where we were staying. The bush buck, very, very handsome, looks like a young deer from here. And just a nice look on the face. Sometimes when you get a nice close-up view of something, it's just worth looking at it for a minute just to see that animal. Wonderful. They're protected in this large national park, so they show little, if any, fear of humans, so you get very close to them. The people there was a little bit different than in East Africa when you're in a Volkswagen bus and you're coming out of the top of the bus and looking at the top. This is the way that a lot of the people toured around. You're right out in the open. We did a lot of walking in the park. In East Africa, you can't get out of the car. Here you can get out of the car. And if you look closely, we're walking in the tracks of elephants that have just walked through that part of the forest. That's how exciting it was. Probably the rarest bird that we saw on this trip was a bird called the Forbes plover. The Forbes plover is found just in burned over areas because the Forbes plover's back color is the same as burnt soil. So I got this lousy picture of a Forbes plover, but again, the rarest bird that we saw on the trip. Camouflage is interesting to see. I love camouflage when I see it. This is the long-tailed nightjar. This is a female, doesn't have a long tail, but such wonderful camouflage of that bird. Little night birding, we went out to look for owls, and there's one off in the distance. This is called the grayish eagle owl, very much like our great horned owl, about the same size. Wonderful feet when you get a close-up of those claws. You can see why, if it's a nocturnal mammal, it's not going to be happy if that gets a hold of the back of your neck. So that's Mole Park, that's number 3. We're going to go now up to number 4, up in the far north of Ghana. This is along the Burkina Faso border. It's a very dry, sub-Saharan part of the world. Very, very different signboards along the road. Ensure your child takes the medicines or they'll be having diarrhea. I mean, it's just a different way of advertising that we would see here in the United States. This is one that I like. Get that sama-sama feeling. Get yourself an outhouse so you can take care of your bodily functions, but typical of the things. This is what the countryside looks like. This is Nigel and our 2 local guides and myself, just to show you the dry, rocky countryside. A little bit further north, you're going to be right in the Sahara, but this area very, very dry. In the north, the religion is Islam. The people there are Muslim. This is a long-term problem. If you followed the politics of the Middle East and the Muslims, and they're killing the Christians, well, you've got the southern half, the rich half of the country, where the businesses are, that's Christian, and in the north you have the Muslims. And in a lot of these African countries, Nigeria, Chad, elsewhere, there have been all sorts of problems because of that. Terrorism, for example, we didn't hear of any of that in Ghana, but the potential for that because of the 2 different religions. We visited this ancient mosque. This is called the Larabanga Mosque that was built in 1421. This is before Columbus came to the Western Hemisphere. That's how old this mosque one was. As I read about this, I found out that the mosque over time was starting to deteriorate. It's made out of mud and pieces of wood. And over the time, it's been rebuilt several times. So this isn't the original mosque from 1421, but it looks very much like it. Again, we had a little bit of tour. We're trying to learn. Nigel wanted us to learn a little bit about the culture besides just the birds. We did see the red-chested swallow. Which Vermont bird does this one look like? Barn swallow. It could be a barn swallow. This bird found just in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa. Again, the sideboards, the things that you see, the culture as you drive down the road. One thing I'd never seen before are billboards announcing the death of someone. This is the lady here that, can you see her age? Age 96. Here's another lady, age 92. And these billboards sit up announcing the death of these people. Even a man, he didn't live as long, 76. Final funeral rites for this fellow. So that was interesting to see. And then finally, the way the people live up in the north. This is, again, completely different countryside than the rainforest of the south. Typical village. The villages are made out of mud and thatched house, sort of like areas of Mexico that you see the locals living this way. You see a mud wall between the houses to keep animals coming in at night. Very, very primitive. The people there primarily have their cattle. This fellow was there, and as I looked closely, there was the yellow-billed oxpecker. There was a bird that's pretty widespread all over Africa. There are two species of oxpecker, the red-billed and the yellow-billed, and this is sort of like a combination of both, but it's the yellow-billed with lots of yellow. Other bird we saw was the Abyssinian Roller, a very, very pretty bird just alongside the roadside. A lifer for me was a chestnut-bellied starling found in the drier areas just of West Africa, next to a vinaceous dove, a little bit more widespread bird, but just right along the roadside, easy to see. The village indigo bird. There are about 8 different species of indigo birds. Some of them look exactly the same. This one's easy to identify because it's the only one with red legs. So if you see red legs, you've seen the village indigo bird, about the size of a wren, or a small sparrow, very small bird sitting up on the wire. The bird that we wanted to see for the other people on the trip, a bird that I'd seen many, many years ago in the Sudan along the Nile River, a bird called the Egyptian plover. And there are very few places in Western Africa where you can see the Egyptian plover easily. Cameroon is one place. Sudan, you can't go there anymore. It's not found in Egypt, so you can't find the Egyptian plover, but they were reported to be some along this river. So my friends were very excited when we found an Egyptian plover, and ended up getting very, very close to some of them. Not in the plover family, they're in their own family. Egyptian plover is a plover-like bird, but not quite a plover. Very beautiful when they fly away. As you get up in the northern part, you're getting close to the desert. A lot of the birds are just dry, open country birds. Here's a bird called the sun lark. You can see how difficult it would be to see unless you saw him fly in there a little bit closer. But these birds that mimic exactly the land that they live on. If they didn't, they would have been eaten by a predator and they wouldn't have been able to reproduce, and they wouldn't have that species with those colors in these habitats. So again, it's interesting to see the camouflage. Here's one called the spotted thick-knee, if you remember the thick-knee we saw earlier with the large eye. But see how difficult that bird is to see off there with all those same colored bushes around him. Spur-wing lapwing. Again, look at the color of the ground and the color of the back. If you were a bird of prey flying overhead trying to look for lapwing lunch and you look down, you wouldn't be able to see this bird because the coloration is exactly the same as its background. And then the sun goes down on our last day up in the north, and we go back to the parking lot and head back south, back to Accra, the capital, and we see this tree and we realize there's something strange on those branches. And we look carefully, and it's covered with straw-colored fruit bats and just hanging from there. Of course, during the night they'll fly off and pollinate fruit, bring back fruit, but I've never seen so many out in the open that way. Fruit bats are pretty common in the tropics, but never seen them along the road. So we finished up in the north where number 4 is. That's where Burkina Faso up in the sub-Saharan area. We're going to come back down to number 5 for our last couple days in Accra. In that part of of Ghana. As we come into the forest again, we see this International Stingless Bee Center. We thought, oh boy, there's a place we got to stop. No, I've never heard of a stingless bee center before, so we passed that by. We went to the Beaubry Forest and Butterfly Sanctuary, home to 400 species of butterflies. That was a little bit more interesting for us. There were lots of different butterflies. I don't remember the names that were called out for these butterflies, but very different looking than the butterflies in the Western Hemisphere. And then finally, the last day, we ran into some geopolitical information. Now, politics usually don't come into play when we travel around the world. Now, if you're in China, maybe you get some politics, but usually you're not thinking politics. In West Africa and Africa today, politics are very important, and they're important from this point of view. Here's a village in the middle of nowhere where everybody has TV, on the roof, and you wonder, well, where did that come from? It came from Red China. It came from communist China. And the sign says the satellite access for 10,000 African villages by mainland China, Red China, communist China. And this is China's effort to try to get in front of the Western countries, European countries and Americans, to control the assets in these Western African countries. And they do it by putting in all these things for free in order that the people are then indoctrinated by the communists. In this case, this village was near a forest called the Atewa Forest. There are 165 million tons of bauxite, this is where aluminum comes from, that have been discovered in this mountain range very close to Accra. Guess what communist China wants? They want those raw materials. So that's why they're making this influence. So to see the geopolitical battle that's going on between especially China in this part of the world, in the western part of the hemisphere. From a bird watching or naturalist point of view, this Atewa Forest is very, very special. It's a shame that probably the Ghana government will give in to the pressure of the communists and let them take out this raw material. Lots of monkeys that are going extinct that lived in this forest. The people there realize that this is a water catchment for the town of Accra. It's important for so many ways, but I think the Chinese are probably going to win in the next several years. There are going to be big mining operations in there. We were lucky. There was one bird that we went to see. This is our last day. The bird was the last of the bee-eaters, the 8th different species of bee-eaters that we saw, the blue-whiskered bee-eater. Another 10 years, this may be almost impossible to see in this part of Africa because of the influx of the Chinese and cutting down the forest, especially in this Atewa area. So we're very, very happy to get that as our last bird. I always have a celebration when I go on a bird trip. It's always an ice cream. My wife always doesn't like to see that, but one small ice cream at the end of the trip isn't going to kill me. So this is Nigel and I celebrating the trip. We had 284 species. 109 were new birds for me, and that's an incredible amount. I'd never been to West Africa. It was so exciting. My brother Peter and I just did a trip to Ecuador. We had 501 species, and I saw 25 lifers out of 500. So to go to a place where 40% of the birds are new birds for your list, really very, very special. So that was West Africa. It was just a fascinating journey. We learned so much about slavery, geopolitics, 109 lifers. Everything was good until I got to the airport to fly home. I looked at the board. I'm flying on Delta Airlines flight going into New York City, leaving just before midnight. It's about the 4th or 5th one down. You see there in yellow. That was the excitement of the last day there in West Africa. Our flight was canceled and we had to go to plan B to get back home, but that's another story. So, thank you all very much. Dum, 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 dum. Any questions?
What month of the year were you there?
That's a good question. October. Yeah. The infrastructure there is so good. You know, if you've been to Africa, if you've been to East Africa or South Africa, it's a part of Africa. There are two parts that are left over after you do East Africa and South Africa. One's the Ethiopian Plateau, and the other is West Africa. West Africa, English-speaking, the people are friendly. Asphalt roads everywhere. I mean, we were hardly ever on a dirt road. Nice national parks, wonderful lodges, great French fries. What can I say? No, it was a fabulous trip. We really had a good time. And just 6 of us, I mean, you really appreciate that. If you're in a group of 30 or 40 and you're in and out of a bus or something like that, but a small group like this rock jumper tour was just perfect for us.
Did that
Rock fowl?
stick around for you?
Yeah, it stayed around. It comes back to that cliff where my friends were hiding out during the rainstorm, and it roosts there during the night. So,
My experience was it saw people, the gray neck, and
yeah, you see that we're in Cameroon, yeah. Cameroon, that's the most famous place to see it, but that's a different species than this one. This is really, really easy to see, and it comes right in. You sit, well, the bench is no longer there, but you can sit on this bench, and these birds are coming in. There are 8 or 10 of them that come to this roost. So they just hop into the vegetation. They sit right up in front of you, very, very close by. It was really a spectacular bird, that unusual and that rare to see
Do
it.
they make their nests on the side of rocks?
Yeah, it's a mud nest inside, sort of like the what the ovenbird, the South American ovenbird does that. Anybody else?
It's not just the Chinese, it's the Russians too, who are in there, especially Central Africa, where they're really.
Oh, really? Really? Yeah.
Reaping the countryside.
Yeah. The Americans and the Europeans are getting left behind, especially by the Chinese. They come in with these infrastructure projects to build a port, to build an airport, to build a university, to put in 10,000 people get television. They get all sorts of information from the Chinese. The propaganda comes through these televisions that they set up. It's really scary to realize that Africa is being taken over. It was European countries historically that were there, but now it's the Russians and the Chinese that are very much at the forefront of this. Pretty scary.
Did you notice the difference between being in African countries that were French-run versus British?
Yeah, I started Africa in 1970 was my first trip, and it was just as the British were leaving East Africa. So I was in Kenya and Uganda, really at the end of the colonial period. And I could see the impact, the positive impact that one slide showed of the things, education and all. And those countries were run so well. There were hospitals, there were schools for the native people too, not just for the Europeans. Roads. And then I went back 10 years later to the same countries after 10 years of Idi Amin in Uganda, for example, and seeing just these places falling apart. In general, I would make the comment that the British did the best job of a colonial power in Africa. The Portuguese, probably the worst job. The French, maybe somewhere in the middle, but the British were very, very good in the way that they colonized Africa and the legacy that they left behind, in my opinion. I'm no expert on that. I'm not expert on anything, but that's my feeling. Anybody else? Yeah.
Go ahead. Are you going to do another trip with your brother?
Oh yeah, we're the Sichuan China trip may work out at the end of May, June if things work out. If the Chinese let people from America coming in with the coronavirus into China. But yeah, we're always planning a trip a year we like to do together. We have a great time.
Now, had you been to that part of West Africa in your career?
I'd been to Ghana once on a business trip, and I was one day at a hotel by the airport, so I saw 20 or 30 birds. So basically I had not birded in West Africa. That's why 109 birds were new out of 300.
So they didn't have good spices in that area?
So no, there were no spices in that area. I tried to pretend there was. I told my boss that there were some red peppers growing there. And he didn't know that red peppers were actually native to the Western Hemisphere. There was no reason for them to be in West Africa. But I stopped actually on my way to Madagascar. I came in through West Africa and got off for a couple of days in Lagos, Nigeria, and in Accra, Ghana. So I had seen a couple of the birds, city birds, open country birds, but nothing like the forest. But just a wonderful trip, great experience, something very different.
Do you have a place in the world where you think you can get 100 birds again?
No, that's finished. No, if I spent a couple of months in the Philippines, I mean, there's some places like that. Maybe Irian Jaya, I've been to New Guinea, but the Irian Jaya part, the western part of the New Guinea island and some offshore islands there, I could spend a month there and maybe get 80 or 90 birds. But most places now it's 20 or 30 new birds for the list. In Sichuan, it's going to be about 30, 35. But they're all fun. I mean, you have fun on a trip, whether you see 100 new birds, whether they're all new birds or whether you just see your target birds. We call them target birds when you go after specific birds that you haven't seen before. And my brother, for some of you who don't know, my brother is the #1 ranked U.S. bird watcher in the world list. He's got 9,500 and wants to be the first person to get to 10,000. So he's working to see all the birds. So we have a good time going out together to try to target birds and see the ones that would be new for our list.
What's your license number now?
7,686. Lots of birds, yeah, until I compare with my brother. And people say, doesn't that make you feel bad that your younger brother, he's 8 years younger than I am, your younger brother has seen more birds? I said, not at all. It's very much like being a college professor and you have a student. I was listening to some of these health people in the last couple of days on the coronavirus, and one guy was saying, I was a professor at so-and-so, and my student is now, she's the one that you heard talking yesterday, you know, that she runs the CDC in Washington or whatever. But I taught him all he knows, I mean, literally. And I've got pictures when I was 16 and he was 8, and we're in the Everglades and we've got binoculars on, and I really did. And the other day he sent me an email and I congratulated him on a talk that he'd just given, and he came back and he said, you are the reason that I am what I am today. So that message came in just yesterday on the email, so he knows that I had an impact on him, and we love the competition, but we're not overwhelmed with it. We just have a great time. Thank you all for coming on such a scary night, Larry, especially you for so far. We'll see you going back up Route 7, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.